better in the world, because everything else that we are challenged to get better at for kids is often in their head. Can you solve this math problem? Can you think? Can you say this thing? But first you got to figure it out in your brain. And it's hard. You can feel really unsuccessful in many endeavors, especially for children who might be struggling with sort of context or other things that might make them feel like they're already behind where they're supposed to be. But then you get on a field or a court and you catch the thing you didn't catch yesterday, or you push yourself and see the ball go a little further. It's unbelievable what that does. And there's this great concept that came out of a book called Raising Resilient Children by these two authors, Brooks and Goldstein. And they talk about this idea of islands of competence, and that the real goal in fostering resilience in children, one of the most important things is to help them have and discover some island of competence. The Search Institute calls it sparks, but I like both concepts. But I learned about the islands of competence things first, and it's always stuck with me because it applies so closely to sport. Like and the theory is that if there's one thing you're good at, it lets you stand on an island of competence in what they call the sea of inadequacy, which too many people spend most of their time in. And then if you have that one island, when you face new challenges, when you are pushed to new elements, when you leave your comfort zone when you don't want to, but you have to be out there, people often consciously and unconsciously reference their island of competence. And the storyline is, well, if I can do that thing over there, I can probably make it through this thing here. And it is a cornerstone of resilience in sport. Everybody should know they're good at some element of using their body in the world in some kind of physical and sport context, because it has such tremendous impact, I think, well outside of sport.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I think that is one of the hardest things in the classroom and on the ball field. And I'm defending the teachers and coaches that aren't able to do this, because it's hard, which is within the job you have, because there is a job that certain things need to be accomplished, is to break with the routine. What you were talking about earlier is to just kind of give up the game plan, saying, hold on a second, I'm going to help them find their way to that, as you're putting it, this island of confidence. That is really hard to do. Do you have any again, I'm going to focus on coaches and teachers here, because I think that's where what you're talking about is probably not skipping over the ring of comfort and into panic. It's that one in between there. Do you have any suggestions on how they, either whether it's, you've mentioned some authors, some books, but are there some simple ideas on how they can kind of identify, stop, and pay that attention briefly to that one student or player, just enough to kind of get towards that island of confidence?
So I think one of the things a couple of things I've seen work. So one of the techniques is what we sometimes call coach the bench and praise the play, which means the competitive elements of sport, the time when you're playing, should really be a time for children and youth to make decisions, learn from them, discover where and when things don't go well, and try again. And they're actually all pretty amped up during that time, and it's harder for them to hear us because we are not in the game. We're on the sideline. We have to shout and yell, and we're often doing a disservice by trying to get inside their decision-making head. It's their chance to test themselves. And if we treat it that way, then the great coach, the great sort of youth development coach, would sit back and relax and make note of all the wonderful things that a young person does, and then be prepared to talk to them on the bench. The bench is historically a place where you kind of suffer from substitution stress and wondering if you're going to get back in and worried that I do something wrong, when actually it could and should be the time where a coach turns their attention towards that player and says, look, let's chat about these choices. Let's revisit that one. How are you feeling? Are you ready for the next time? Because they are physically slowing down. Their brain is probably better processing at that moment. And then you get all this sort of pro-social connection between a coach and a player by being in a closer proximity to them and being able to make eye contact and talk at a lower voice. And so I think that's one thing that works. I think this is not necessarily a new idea, but I don't think we think about it enough, is that the substitution is just one of the most powerful tools a coach has. And so being willing to risk, quote unquote, losing the game to create a substitution rubric that actually supports building this sense of competence for players. So that can go anywhere from, not subbing a player out after they make a mistake, but waiting until they get a chance to play some time afterwards so they don't make that terrible association of and fear of, well, when I make a mistake, I now have to leave the game. And so my confidence is now completely tied into my coach's judgment. I have a colleague I've known who has this remarkable substitution plan for basketball teams she coaches, where no matter what the team is, no matter what the game is they're playing against, whether it's regular season, end of season, playoffs, championships, she guarantees every single player real playing time in the first half of the game. And if she has to, she will adjust the play in the second half because that may be what's needed for certain parts of a season, but she guarantees every player a chance to do that. And that the message that sends to players, as opposed to, and I was one of these players. I was a 4-year backup goalkeeper in college. And I think I played the equivalent of about 5.5 games over my total 60 games I watched. Mm-hmm. It's no fun to only be subbed in when you're up by 4 goals or down by 6, because it basically sends the story of, I know your play won't impact the game. And I also never got to learn how to play with the most skilled players on my team because nobody cared at that point. And what she does with her subs is that, all the players are in. And so the most skilled players have to learn how to play with the players who are less skilled and adjust their game so they become a stronger team. And the lesser skilled players get better because, of course, we get better when we're pushed and challenged to play at a higher level. I just think it's one of the best things I've ever seen. And we talk about, rotating substitutions and all these things, but the substitution element of sport is, I think, one of the most underutilized tools. It's not just a technique, it's an entire part of the game that if a coach chose to adopt that as a way to promote a sense of competence, you could do that in probably every single player just by reimagining how you substitute and what you do with your players on the bench.
And, you're making me think back to when I played some club sports in college, when I picked up lacrosse in the Midwest, which, again, that's in the 80s, 90s, that not very well known. But you just said, I want to play, and they let you out there. But what they did, I remember for me in particular, was they saw what you could do, because putting 3 guys on a line that didn't know how to throw the ball, pick it up, or catch it wasn't doing anybody any favor. And they actually did break us up. And this was a team run by 19 and 20-year-old guys that wanted to win. We weren't, overly mature, but they realized they would seed us when we were first learning with 2 other players on that line. And what you were describing was the same thing, which was those other players had to be on top of their game because I know I sure couldn't read their mind, or let alone read the field at that time to know what to do. So they had to communicate better with me. And at the same time, I had someone that I could see what was going on, and it was great to be on the field with 2 people that knew what they were doing. And, we went on the field and there were 3 of us. We were all clueless, and we just said, well, let's just try not to shoot it in the wrong goal. I mean, that was really kind of the best you could hope for. So that makes sense. And I love that you talked about the bench coach, because I think that is one of the, especially in true youth sports below the high school level, is the value of you coach to the bench, because they really can't hear a thing you say. It's one thing if there's a break in the play, to kind of tell them the position, things like that.
Right.
But the real learning is you turn to the players on the bench. Do you think that, where I see it happen sometimes at the youth level, but I see it unfortunately almost non-existent in a lot of typical high school benches, that there are 4 to 14 players on the sideline that they're just talking to each other because nobody else is talking to them. There is no coach that's enlightening. Is that a trend that you see, or maybe it's just what I'm noticing, that it just tends to drop off more and more as you go from youth up to high school?
I think the orientation gets to such a focus on the winning aspects of the game and your star players. And then you're supporting characters, you're supporting team members, and everyone becomes kind of role players. And I think we forget that we're trying to potentially build a team that has depth. I mean, there's certain teams in certain leagues around the country and the world that are well known, that and they're rare, right? That no matter who goes out of a game, that coach doesn't worry because they're 2 or 3 deep on players who can step in. And other teams are very fragile. Most teams are, because they don't spend enough time being willing to develop everybody. I mean, I think, the bench is a construct that, and I've talked a lot about this with some colleagues of mine, and the idea of trying to reimagine what our non-playing field or court area space is used for, and why wouldn't you want all your players to be moving and active and trying to get ready to play and testing their skills and et cetera, not just in terms of a classic warm-up, but in terms of what you did with your space. This idea of you're either running around and fully exerting yourself or you have to sit, to me, just doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of our desire to have everybody ready to play. And so you couple kind of a reimagining of the bench with a better and kind of more interesting and creative approach to substitutions, not just at the coach level, but at the league level. And this, comes full circle back to the sports system redesign concepts that John McCarthy and Megan Bartlett and I have played with for a long time of, well, what if you just change the rules of the whole league? What if everybody had to sub a certain way? What if the bench became a place to do something very different? What if you went so far as to say anybody not on the bench was playing some kind of small-sided game against the other substitutes on the other team, and those points mattered for the score? I mean, you could really start to think of some wonderfully creative ways to get everybody engaged. And the bench is just a stopping point to get back to whatever the play is, not kind of the place to sit for a long part of your career until you can't take it anymore and you quit.
Yeah, and I do want to really recommend this book that the three of you wrote. It's Redesigning Youth Sport, Change the Game by John McCarthy, Lou Bergholz, and Megan Bartlett. And to what you just mentioned, people listening probably say, well, no, we have rules for these games. You go changing the rules so much, it's not the game anymore. A minor spoiler alert for the book. Early on, and I think it was a really good place to put this story, you all describe how the game of basketball changed. And we all would swear it's always been 5 people in a 10-foot hoop. And I won't get into the details, but the game changed tremendously from the beginning. It was not, here's how I think we ought to do it. It wasn't working, or it wasn't getting what it should from it. So that game, which is a truly American game, it had so many evolutions early on just to try and make it work better. And I suspect people liked a lot of those versions till it got to the one current that seemed to provide the most benefits.
I think the unfortunate piece is that we always tilt our hat towards the professional or the collegiate level, and when they make changes, it trickles down to high school and then eventually to middle school, and we're caught in this sort of desire to only look at that level for how we would play the game. And when those rules change, we'll change our rules. Unfortunately, at the pro level, the rules are primarily built around fan attendance, sometimes around parity across a league, but it's a business. And then there's a safety piece that sometimes leagues look at as well. And at the youth development level, there's so many other outcomes that could happen. And I think part of why we wrote the book is to really challenge that middle level. I think at the youth level, at the level for children, people can imagine changing the game because they're just getting into that competitive level of their life. And at the college and pro level, we don't have our hands in that, so we'll wait and see what they do. But the real power would be at the high school level and maybe at the collegiate level to change some things that kind of create athletes for life, that create much more parity and competition across many different levels, and that could just, I think, have such a huge impact on participation and joy that comes out of all this sport work we like to do.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic book. And am I correct that you also are working on another book right now?
I am, yeah. I think I'm hopefully just a few months out from being able to publish. It's a body of work that's been a part of my career, actually, probably since undergraduate life, that I've slowly evolved for, again, it's kind of close to maybe over 2 decades now. And it's around this concept of vital connections, which is kind of the language I use to put on this incredibly large body of work that has been studying resilience and where and how children survive and thrive, especially in very challenging situations and circumstances, and that there's many things